I'm very pleased to hand the floor over to our first keynote speaker of today's program, the award-winning journalist and staff writer for The New Yorker, Adam Gopnik, who has written extensively about cities, their wonders and their contradictions, and joins us today with insight on how we might each contribute to the shape of our great city. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. That was wonderful to hear. Any Bill of Rights that involves destroying and rebuilding Penn Station is one to which I subscribe. I also couldn't applaud internally more loudly at the insistence on putting an end to the particular kind of tall building. We all know which one I'm referring to, which is known informally in our family as the oligarch's erection. Nothing could make me happier than speaking to the MAS, truly. It's been something that's played a huge role in my life, and directly and indirectly, and I want to talk about that for a moment. But naturally, when I was organizing what I wanted to say to you this morning, over the past month, the temper and tone of my remarks changed radically last Tuesday. I realized that what I had to say, given the realities of a new set of contradictions in our city and indeed in our country, would be somewhat different, more pointed, in some ways darker than they might have been only a week ago. Cities are made of contradictions. Gina said that, and I think that's true. But we've never felt the intensity of those contradictions more, I think, than we have this week. On the one hand, we have people demonstrating outside that gold-plated barra door on Fifth Avenue. If any of you are Tolkien fans, you'll know what I reference. And we recognize that that tower represents many powerful elements in New York City and in its history, and we recognize that the people protesting beneath it represent an equally powerful element of rejection. That's a contradiction even more powerful, potentially potent, potentially perilous than any of the others that I was going to talk about today. But first, before I try to enter into that world of power politics, let me say a few words about the man who more than any other brought me to the MAS and brought me to you today, and that was the great Brendan Gil. Now, Brendan Gil, some of you will know, was at once chairman of the MAS for many years, and I was privileged to edit Brendan for a decade when I was a young pup editor at The New Yorker. Brendan needed editing rather the way Fred Astaire needed advice on dressing. His pieces flowed out naturally, effusively, and required absolutely not a touch. Nonetheless, it was part of the decorum of the world that he had to have an editor, and I, as a kid, rather in a my favorite year way, was given that role. One of the things that I learned from Brendan was that it was possible to love New York and to preserve New York, not in a pious or puritanical spirit, but in a spirit of wild, ecstatic appreciation. And I'll never forget the morning in 1991 when we went together to look at these windows, these Lalique windows that are now on what is now Henry Bendel's, that had originally been made for the Coty building many years before, that had been entirely begrimed and beclouded and lost for more than 50 years, and that suddenly, in the course of the restoration of the building for Bendel's, had been rediscovered. These astonishing Lalique windows, which we still are privileged to see today on Fifth Avenue. I'll never forget that morning seeing them, in part because I had begun a novel as a kid in Montreal called The Standards, about an imaginary songwriting team who had built a theater that had a penthouse with Lalique windows on it. And that intersection of the most delirious fantasy one could possibly have about the New York one was still approaching, with the reality of a New York being newly restored, was one of the thrilling moments of my life as a citizen of this city. Our dreams of New York begin in our imaginations, and then, astonishingly and repeatedly, become realized by the truths of the city. Dreams of New York, that phrase rings a little heavy this morning, I know, but I shall pursue it anyway. We go to cities not only for work and not only for love and to live. We go to cities, or at least to New York particularly, for thrills. We go to cities for that ecstatic experience that Brendan Gil sought out and shared with me on that still, magical morning. Our pieties should never drown out our pleasures, even in a time of crisis like this one. I've been writing about cities, it's true, and particularly about New York, as Gina said, for more than 36 years now, since I first arrived in New York in 1980. And I wanted today to kind of put together some principles. At times of crisis, the one good thing about a time of crisis is that it forces us back onto our first principles. It makes us think again about what we believe, what we truly believe, what's essential, and what's superfluous. So let me try and formulate some primary first principles, even if they tend to entangle and twist and bite their own tails at times. My first principle about cities, and particularly New York, is cities can never win. Cities can never win. There's always something wrong about the condition of the city at any one time. We will never be happy with the New York we have. Never. There's always something fundamentally discontenting about the circumstance we find. I've lived through one of the greatest transformations in New York, and I am a witness to that truth. I left, as I said, 36 years ago. I got on a bus in Montreal, Canada, that said New York City on the front, just like in a bad musical from the 1940s, with my then girlfriend, soon-to-be wife, and I can only begin to summon up for you the look of panic on my good father's face as he watched us board that bus. Because in the spring of 1980, to be going to New York was not to be going to Oz, it was to be going to some special circle of hell in his imagination. That was very much the New York of taxi driver times. It was a New York that was widely perceived by the most intelligent observers as a city that had failed in every way, a city that was plagued by violence, inequality, whose urban crises were in many respects, particularly after the blackout of the mid-'70s, were seen as insoluble. A few small neighborhoods clung to the park. The crisis of the inner city was such. Robert Caro's book on Robert Moses, as you'll recall, was about Robert Moses and the fall of New York. Fort to city dropped dead. That was the epigraph and the haiku of that time, and it placed a look of panic on my father's face as his oldest son went off to go there. 36 years later, every single trend that seemed true at that time has reversed, sometimes almost comically so. Crime is radically down in everyone's apprehension except Donald Trump's. For complicated reasons that, fascinatingly, we still haven't fully understood. I did a long piece a couple of years ago about Herman Zimrig, the great criminologist from the University of California, whose study of what made crime fall in New York is too complicated for me to sum up today, but its essential truth is that there were many small truths, 1,000 small sanities and wise policies brought down crime in New York. No one policy, not stat policing, certainly not stop and frisk, no one thing. It was building 1,000 small walls. It was pursuing 1,000 small sanities that made crime descend, as it did throughout the Western world, but did with particularly radical impetus here in New York. At the same time, where our beloved Jane Jacobs wrote about the despoilation of Brooklyn and the Bronx, if you really want to see someone who has contempt for a borough, read Jane Jacobs on Brooklyn. She really did not care for Brooklyn. And now, of course, we know that that great suction pump that sent kids from Moss Hart and onward from the depths of Brooklyn into New York has totally reversed in its energies. So now my son's tenderly brought up in mid-Manhattan and up on the Upper East Side, his only goal in life is to get to Bushwick as rapidly and as easily as he can every day. And he reports back to me on the beauty of Bushwick life, the joy of Bushwick dining, the charms of Bushwick social life, and makes me feel horribly guilty for having brought him up in my blue-collar way on the streets of the Upper East Side. That's a story that's being repeated in 1,000 families all the time. Astounding. No one would have predicted that in 1980. We are living now in a New York whose crises are in many ways crises of affluence and overabundance, crises of too many people pressing on too few resources, and particularly too many wealthy people driving out those of less wealth and of less affluence from their traditional homes and their traditional neighborhoods. That presents a series of grave and powerful urban problems, but they're not the same problems that we were dealing with in 1980. And the discontents that they create in all of our minds are very different from the discontents we were dealing with a mere 35 years ago. We feel as unhappy with the crises that we have to struggle with and that we're attempting to overcome as my father felt in 1980 watching me go off to New York. There are different crises and they demand different solutions. But cities will never be at rest and we will never be content with the city we have. Now, that's partly because I think human beings are never content with anything. If we live in a golden age, we go around complaining that everything looks so yellow. But I think that cities make us particularly discontent and make us particularly perpetually discontent for a couple of reasons that are maybe a little more subtle, a little harder to see. First, because cities, before they are anything else, are the cradles of cosmopolitan civilization. The cradles of cosmopolitan civilization, and they engage us always in a practice of coexistence more even than they articulate a principle of pluralism. What do I mean by that? Well, simple way to get it is to go up and look at the wonderful show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art right now, devoted to the city of Jerusalem in the years from 1000 to 1100. I just finished a series of lectures about this show a week ago. And what's astounding about this show, and I urge every urbanist to go see it, is that what it shows us is that far from being a cockpit of conflict in the first part of that century, Jerusalem was a place where those three great religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and all their multiple sects, on the whole, coexisted. They shared marketplaces. They shared wares. You find Jewish text written in Arabic. There's a whole vein of Islamic glass, which to this day, no one is certain is Islamic glass made for European import or European glass made in imitation of Islamic examples. What we find when we look at Jerusalem at that time is this wonderful entanglement of different peoples and different practices, tragically destroyed by the power of religious fanaticism at the end of that century. Pluralism is a practice in that way before it ever becomes a principle. It's a way of our getting along. And that's one of the truths about New York, and it is inherently undramatic. The Crusades and conflict are dramatic. Coexistence is undramatic. We could write a musical about the Hasidim and the hipsters battling for Williamsburg, and an interesting musical it might be, but much harder. I've actually written it, and you're laughing. It's called Table, and it'll open at the Long Wharf Theater in New Haven next May. You laugh, but it's so. Absolutely. Well, okay, we're going to run a bus from our house to anyone who wants to come. But it's so we can find and locate areas of dramatic conflict for our entertainment and illumination, but it's much harder to tell the equally and even more important story of coexistence among Hasidim and hipsters and Caribbean people, West Indians, Ethiopians, all living together. When we walk on the 6 train in the morning, as I did, wet and bedraggled earlier today, we don't see something naturally dramatic, but we see something nearly miraculous. That is people from fundamentally different backgrounds and kinds somehow managing to live together in, on the whole, peaceful and productive ways. Cities are inherently collections of contradictions. They bring together many peoples and kinds and classes. That's self-evident, I know, but it still is terribly important to recall because that entanglement, that coexistence, whether in Jerusalem in 1100 or New York in 2016, is very easy to look past as we pay attention to conflict. Let me try and explain what I have in mind a little more by talking a bit about the woman who has been on all of our minds who care about cities in the past year, and that is my old friend, Jane Jacobs. I wrote a long essay in praise of Jane Jacobs, who, as I said in the essay, which I then delivered as a lecture at the Eldridge Street Synagogue, truly one of the amazing and sacred spaces in New York City, and one that only was preserved through efforts of organizations like this one. And one of the things that about Jane Jacobs, who was one of the 3 people I have met in a lifetime of interviewing people who had a truly saintly aura, who you met and 5 minutes later you said, this woman can change the world by the force of her personality and the intensity of her belief. And one of the things I wanted to celebrate in that essay was Jane's greatest poetic invention, and that was the ballet of the sidewalk. The ballet of the sidewalk. I'm sure everyone in this room has read that indelible pages from The Death and Life of Great American Cities, where Jane Jacobs talked about how every day on Hudson Street, a completely improvised and unplanned ballet went on amongst the butcher and the hardware store maker, amongst the kids on the street, the mothers with strollers, in which everyone played what looked like an assigned role, but was in fact an entirely self-emerging and self-organized play of urban delight, but also of urban protection. It was the ballet of the street, she insisted, at a time when crime was on the rise, that protected people most effectively. One of her great polemics was for the street and against the playground as a place in which to segregate children for playing. They're much better off playing classic New York City street games than they were being forced into playgrounds to play basketball. That ballet of the street for her defined everything cities could be, both for the delight they give us, but also for the essential civility they provide for all of us. And I recall when I did move to New York in that fall of 1980, how overwhelmed I was as a Canadian by the ballet on East 87th Street. We had rented the smallest apartment in New York, a 9-by-11 basement room. And every day we would see that city ballet go on sidewalk ballet go on 87th Street. The guys from Wankel's Hardware would mix with the guys from Weinstein's Hardware over sandwiches at the 87th Street Deli. The guys from Anna Maria Pizza would constantly be in conversation with the Chinese restaurant across the way. There was a constant living example of the power of civic cosmopolitanism when you simply stepped out of your tiny room onto the street. Well, I hardly need tell you that that beautiful sidewalk ballet is now threatened where once it flourished. In the place where Weinstein's Hardware once flourished, there is now a Duane Reade. In the Wankel's Hardware, still survives, but in the place where the Chinese restaurant once was open all night long, providing eyes on the street and lights on the street, there is now, of course, a bank. Farther east in my own neighborhood, one of the miracles of New York is you can move one street. We've moved from 87th Street to 88th Street, but changed our roles and our purposes in life. Where once there were toy stores and magazine stores, all have been stripped away. And again, what we find is a kind of eerie monoculture of banks and drugstores, varied only by the occasional store selling French baby clothes. This is one of the great mysteries of the monoculture of New York right now, is that there seems to be no room anymore for toys, wine, magazines, books, but there is lots of room for baby clothes from France. My theory of that is that they are part of the settlement of hedge fund divorces as they work out. Well, we ask why. We all see this happening. We see this happening and we ask why. And we search for villains, and we find them. Some of them are real. The forces of blind development bulldozing communities, the absence of commercial rent control and sufficient protection for small merchants and community mom-and-pop businesses. But let's not delude ourselves. One of the problems, a deeper contradiction in the history of cities, is that exactly the same extraordinary forces of free markets and free exchange that create that beautiful ballet of the street end by subverting it. The same enormous creative forces that the free market unleashes, that allows the Weinstein boys to open a hardware store because they know that people will need toggle boats, that allowed on Hudson Street the local Italian butcher to offer his variety meats because he knew there was an appetite for them. That same process of buying and selling cancels itself out. Free market economics are hugely creative and wildly destructive at the same time. We are caught as citizens of a city in both ends of that cycle. And we delude ourselves, I think, however progressive-minded we are, if we think that we can simply cancel out that cycle easily or quickly. And let me add, as we say that, and I know you'll be spending much of this day looking at specific solutions, specific plans, zoning plans, redistricting plans, plans for commercial rent control, many things that those are entirely salutary. I am with you and behind you, and I will vote for you. But let's also keep in mind, in the interests of a broader historical truth, that the transformations that I've described, that we see so strongly here in New York, are, if not universal, astonishingly widespread. One of the startling things that happens is if you look, I lived in Paris for most of the 1990s, took a break, and almost every crisis of the kind I'm describing now in New York, we can find duplicated in Paris. What's happening in Williamsburg happened before in the Marais. What's happening now in Bushwick is happening in the 19th arrondissement. The same thing is true of London. The same thing is true even in Rome. If any of you know the story of the transformation of the Monte neighborhood in Rome, wonderful book by a Harvard urban anthropologist about it. The oldest proletarian working class neighborhood in Rome, totally transformed in the past 15 years by exactly the same forces that we see transforming Williamsburg, Crown Heights, and so on. We can describe those forces, I think, very simply. In fact, the rich buy out the middle class, and then the children of the middle class buy out the poor. That's the same process that we've seen, whether we're in London at Spitalfields, whether in Rome or Monte, or whether here in New York at Brooklyn. That doesn't mean we shrug and accept it. We're not prisoners of that, but we have to be ever more skilled perceivers of the extent, the historical origins, and the duration, the width and breadth, if you like, of the problem that is created by the simple Jacobean truth that people want to live in cities. And when people are able to live in cities, they do live in cities, and people with more resources will tend to push out people with less from the best parts of the cities, or the most attractive part to live in. The solution, I said in my long essay about Jane Jacobs, is politics. And I criticized Jane Jacobs to some controversy for scanting the role of politics in making the city. Jane believed strongly and passionately that politics were the planners, the people she despised so much, the planners who worked from on high, the Robert Moseses and Ed Logues of the world, who worked from on high and imposed solutions on streets and communities. She hated the word neighborhoods. People tend to forget that about Jane Jacobs. She didn't believe neighborhoods existed. She believed only in streets and cities. But she had contempt for those planners for all the reasons we know. They were the people who drove expressways through Washington Square. They were the people who were trying to tear up Central Park. But as a consequence, it left her, saint though she is, heroine though she should always be, it left her, I think, a little blind to the power and necessity of politics in remaking our cities. We always have to replace the ballet of the sidewalk with the politics of the city, and we should not be ashamed or afraid to address that. That's a necessary battle that will always be fought, and it remains essential to reconciling differences that won't reconcile themselves. What shapes cities are contradictions of opposing forces, none of them inherently evil, all of them pressing for purchase on the same space and the same resources. Well, politics on this Tuesday morning have a different ring than they had a mere week ago. When I wrote about politics in that essay about Jane Jacobs, I had in mind, perhaps too fatuously, the way that politics arrive through the exchange of views and interests at more or less acceptable negotiated solutions, ways of going on. But we're foolish if we don't see that the real end of politics, or a legitimate end of politics, is power. Power, plain and simple. And never before, I think, in the history of this city and this country have we been presented so starkly with an alternate vision of what politics are that are simply all about power, not about the happy battle of many different kinds, but about simply the claim to power and of power. I hope you'll forgive me if I say that in one dark moment last week, I was reading one of my favorite books about the city, Five Families, The History of the Mafia in New York. And I came upon this conversation between two true New Yorkers, Sal Avellino and Richard DeLuca, from a 1983 wiretap, which went right through me because it summed up the view of politics as power, which is exactly the opposite of our liberal view of politics as the healthy battle that leads to the ballet. Richard Avellino said, before he was straightened out, talking about one of the wise guys, he was telling me that the unions is his, So I'm saying, what do you mean the unions is yours? He believes the fucking union is his. And what am I going to say? Union? Nothing is yours. Everything is the boss's. And Corralo says, yeah, you operate at his pleasure. And Avalon says, you do what he wants. Even if you got a legitimate thing that's yours, you operate at his pleasure 99% of the time. That's the dark vision of what politics brings. That's the dark vision of politics as pure power descending down from the boss at whose pleasure you work. That's the fear, that's the specter that we all live with this day, and that we have to counteract with our own different kind of politics, a politics that believes in the possibility of fundamentally different kinds, nonviolently fighting out their interests in and around the city to arrive at solutions we can live with. If that sounds unduly grim, or perhaps not sufficiently hopeful, if we imagine the future of the city, at least for the next few years, as one between the ineradicable, unstoppable forces of power against our own little bleedings for community politics, let me give you an end with two, I hope, marginally cheering thoughts. One is about the man who I think is the greatest of all New Yorkers, and the other is about dog shit. Let me talk about dog shit first, before I come to my hero. All of us who are old enough can remember the coming of the pooper scooper law. We can remember how truly benumbed with dog shit the streets and parks of New York were before it came. And if your memory is long enough and goes back far enough, you'll know that there was overwhelming pessimism about the possibility of this ridiculous law actually working. It had teeth of a kind, but they were hardly as sharp as those of a pit bull. It had enforcement mechanisms of a sort, but they seemed very weak. And what it demanded that people do, that is, pick up their own dog's dog shit in some kind of receptacle and advance it to a common deposit box, this seemed absurd to ask of famously anarchic, disputative New Yorkers. And yet, it is a prime example of exactly Jane Jacobs' ballet of the street. The ballet of the street I see every morning when I walk our little Havanese is exactly the ballet of people of all kinds and all classes bending over with little plastic bags to pick up dog shit. No one enforces it, really. We understand that it's a law. We all consent to it as an act of civic necessity. That's an astonishing thing if you think about it. Nobody would have predicted that that would work, that the simple feeling of common community enforcement would enable us to clean up the streets of New York, if not of the oligarchs and the tycoons and the ugliness, at least of the dog shit. That's a good moral. That's something worth remembering whenever we feel discouraged about our possibility of making a change, in this case, very literally, from the ground up. Let me talk, though, as well about the man I think is the greatest New Yorker. It would be fun we could nominate greatest New Yorkers out onto the horizon. But my nomination for the greatest New Yorker is Frederick Law Olmsted. Now, we know Olmsted has a candidacy as the greatest New Yorker because of what he did. He, along with Vaux, built and designed Central Park. But that's not why he's my hero. That's not why I think he's the greatest New Yorker. I think he's the greatest New Yorker because of the journalism he wrote for the then new New York Times in the years just before the Civil War. It remains still, he went south, remains still the greatest book written about the South in the years before the Civil War. He went south as a Northerner to observe the slave states, and he came away not only indignant and horrified at the practices of slavery, but with a key insight which would enliven and enlighten Central Park and should still enliven and enlighten us. He said to himself, people say that the South, although it's a slave state, has a much more elevated culture than the North, but I don't see it. I don't see it at all. I see people locked paralytically into their own social roles and their social place. And when I come to the North, I see people who have the freedom to form their own associations. I see a North that's filled with volunteer fire clubs and amateur opera associations. I see a North that's filled with people playing the new sport of baseball freely. I see a world of independent and self-sustaining small organization. And he had a beautiful name for those things. We sometimes call those forms of human interaction social capital or civil society. Olmsted had a still better name for it. He called it the commonplace civilization of our lives. All of those things that were not under the banner, that were not under the dome of official culture, but which nonetheless gave us all real identity, not just as individuals, but as citizens, the commonplace civilization of our culture. And Central Park, top-down example, not a Jane Jacobin instance, and it's interesting that Jane does not stop to praise Central Park as much as one might think she would in Death and Life of Great American Cities. An example of the kind of thing you're all going to be talking about today, how we use government wisely and sanely to intervene to give us a better city. Central Park remains the primary arena of commonplace civilization for Manhattanites from that day to this, a place in which every imaginable kind of social exchange, from the people who would sleep outside in the years before air conditioning on hot summer nights, as my elderly colleagues at the New Yorker, like Brendan, would remind me happened, to the kids now who fill it for demonstrations, to those of us who go for concerts, to softball, and beyond, to 1,000, 1,000,000 small sanities and different uses that are possible because we together built a place where commonplace civilization could flourish. Yesterday night, I went back to Bendel's, where Brendan Gil had given me that first ecstatic apprehension of the possibilities of restoration in New York. And I looked out those beautiful, once begrimed Lalique windows. And through them, of course, I saw one thing, Trump Tower, directly across the street, surrounded by police, looking scarily and eerily like the citadel of the police state that New York must never become. But then I remember that those windows had once been invisible to us and covered with grime, and now they are there. The moral of my morning with Brendan is, I hope, a useful moral for you to take with you today. No window, no matter how begrimed it may become, is ever shut for good from the light. Thank you very much.